Exorcism of George Lukins. George Lukins was as plain a young man as you could find, 26 years old, a tailor by profession, and a part-time courier to make ends meet. Living in North Somerset, he was well known as a friendly and helpful member of the community who could be found at church every Sunday morning and participating in the Christmas pageant each December. That all changed when, during the pageant of Christmas 1760, an invisible force threw him several feet, and he awoke as something more than a plain young man. Introducing the 7 demons of the Yadin demoniac. The Yadin demoniac, as George Lukins would forever be known, technically could be considered possessed, but he was something far more notable, an event that pointed to Lukins' pre-existing ability to serve as a living lexicon of the demonic. It's said that as soon as the very next day, George Lukins spoke to a close friend, telling her that his body had been taken by 7 demons and that the devil himself was present to guide these demonic beings. Understandably, nobody took his statement seriously, but as time went on, Lukins began to exhibit bizarre symptoms, increasing in veracity and number each day. The first of these was the general lethargy with which his movements began to adopt a sluggish tone with each step or motion. Following that, his skin grew pale, and the color began to bleed from his eyes until they were almost entirely white, but the most notable were the seizures. Long before George Lukins began speaking in tongues or with voices other than his own, he was writhing as if in pain and frantic movements that would have resembled a seizure if it were not for the giant smile across his face. Over the next few years, Lukins was seen by many doctors, including an eminent surgeon from Rington. None of these could determine a medical condition that would account for all symptoms, although the rare condition of Sydenham's chorea was eventually decided upon as the only possibility. Sydenham's chorea, historically known as St. Vitus dance, requires specific pre-existing conditions, and even with those conditions, it only occurs in 20% to 30% of patients. The most necessary of the pre-existing conditions for Sydenham's chorea is rheumatic fever, which in itself requires a throat infection. As I said, it's rare. Despite that, the doctors were happy to declare that George Lukins was suffering from chronic and repeated throat infections, which repeatedly caused rheumatic fever, which repeatedly caused Sydenham's chorea, about once a week. As a result, Lukins was admitted to St. George's Hospital in London. His time at St. George's Hospital did not last long, as it was obvious that the initial diagnosis of Sydenham's chorea couldn't possibly be correct. By this time, approximately 12 years had passed since George Lukins was first struck at the Christmas pageant, and it was around this time that the true diagnosis of possession became impossible to ignore. Upon Lukins' return home to North Somerset, the voices became stronger and more clearly audible, at times singing in strange sounds reminiscent of a language but matching none. It would later be discovered that what he was singing was in fact all 200 words of the Te Deum in its original Latin, inverted, meaning the Latin words were placed in reverse order with each word pronounced backward. George Lukins did not speak Latin. In 1778, 18 years after that Christmas pageant, a woman named Sarah Barber traveled through North Somerset and, while there, took an interest in what must have looked to everyone else like the village madman. Between his fits and the singing, Lukins managed to tell her the same account he told her 18 years ago, that he was the vessel of 7 powerful demons guided by the devil himself. However, he also explained that only the power of the Trinity invoked by 7 men of God could end his torments. He explained this while telling Mrs. Barber that it must never be done. Presumably, he then went back to singing the entire Te Deum in reverse. I can only imagine what an unsettling sight it must have been, but nonetheless, Mrs. Barber did not heed the warning and instead called upon the Reverend Joseph Easterbrook. It's important to stop here for a moment and explain just what a demoniac truly is. One known as a demoniac is spoken about in the earliest verses of the Bible as something far different than one possessed and influenced by demonic powers. In the demoniac, his personality seems to be destroyed, and his actions, words, and even thoughts seem to be overborne by the evil spirit on its path for the kingdom of man. They were not vessels but rather gateways for demonic entities. George Lukins was not possessed in the traditional sense of much as he had stopped the entities from traveling through him. You may now understand why Lukins was adamant that the 7 demons stay where they are. Reverend Joseph Easterbrook found his 6 men of God, who, along with himself, decided upon the Trinitarian rites and had George Lukins brought to Temple Church in Bristol. On Friday, June 13, 1778, the 7 clergymen began their exorcism of Mr. Lukins in the attached vestry of Temple Church. A strange choice of location, but perhaps they too felt an inkling of what was about to occur. Upon beginning the rites, George Lukins calmed down and spoke in a powerful voice not previously heard as one of the 7 demons. That voice spoke directly to the clergymen and stated that George Lukins' torment would be 1,000 times worse for trying such a foolish attempt as an exorcism. The last portion of this story tells that with the words "in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit," George Lukins was freed of his torments. His demeanor was described as calm and happy. He thanked the clergymen, exclaimed "Blessed Jesus," and then began laughing. The case garnered considerable attention from the press, the scientific community, and the church. It was written about in many books, but no mention is ever made of what became of George Lukins after that Friday, the 13th. It seems from the immediate description that the torments, the seizures, and the speaking in tongues were all gone, but the question is, does that mean the demons were gone?